Before midnight on May 13, 2026, three events occurred in geographically separate theaters that, placed inside a single analytical frame, constitute the most compressed collection of escalation indicators this conflict has produced since the opening strikes of Operation Epic Fury. Not a diplomatic breakthrough. Not a ceasefire extension. Not a unilateral gesture from Tehran designed to generate favorable headlines at the Beijing summit. A massive explosion in Shiraz, the capital of Fars province, 850 kilometers southeast of Tehran, in a city containing significant concentrations of Iranian underground missile storage infrastructure. Chinese cargo vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz blockade enforcement zone during the precise 36-hour diplomatic window when President Trump is seated across from Xi Jinping in Beijing. And multiple B-1 Lancer strategic bombers running training missions from air bases in England, tracking south through European airspace on flight paths oriented toward the Middle East. All three of these in the same 24-hour window, all of them simultaneous. All of them while Iran's Foreign Minister Araki is publicly claiming that Kuwaiti naval forces unlawfully attacked an Iranian civilian vessel in the Persian Gulf, detaining 4 citizens whose operational profiles the Kuwaiti security services have already determined are not consistent with fishermen. The gas leak explanation for the Shiraz explosion is the explanation Iran uses every time something detonates near infrastructure the regime does not want to acknowledge exists. The Isfahan incident. The Natanz power interruption. The Parchin irregularity logged by IAEA inspectors in 2021. Gas leaks. Electrical faults. Industrial accidents, each one conveniently proximate to facilities the regime has classified at the highest internal security tier. Let that sit for a moment. The New York Times published an assessment on May 12, 2026, based on multiple intelligence collection streams, satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and human source reporting coordinated across at least 3 allied intelligence services, stating that Iran has retained 70% of its pre-war ballistic missile stockpile, maintained 70% of its mobile transporter erector launcher inventory, and regained access to 90% of its underground missile storage and launch facilities nationwide. The assessment describes these facilities as currently partially or fully operational. That is the operational context inside which the Shiraz explosion occurred on May 13th. To understand why the convergence of the Shiraz explosion, the missile retention assessment, the Chinese weapons flow, and the B-1 training runs constitutes a strategic inflection point rather than a collection of coincidental events, you need to understand the specific mechanism through which ceasefire periods function inside IRGC operational doctrine. The IRGC does not treat ceasefires as termination events. It treats them as bounded reconstitution windows, defined periods during which military preparation continues below the threshold of declared hostilities, rebuilding the inventory and infrastructure that the next phase of fighting will require. Every ceasefire the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has operated under since the 1988 Iran-Iraq War armistice has been used this way, not as breathing space for diplomacy. As preparation time, that is, open loop 1. If Iran is reconstituting its underground missile infrastructure at 90% facility access recovery during an active ceasefire window, precisely what is it preparing to fire, from which specific geographic coordinates, against which target set, and on what operational timeline? The Shiraz explosion on May 13th may have just partially answered that question, in ways the regime's information management apparatus cannot contain, because the explosion itself is the answer. Open Loop 2 sits inside the financial architecture. The blockade is costing Iran $500 million per day. 73 Iranian tankers are motionless in Gulf anchorages, and the CIA assessment places the regime's financial endurance window at 3 to 4 months. But the missile reconstitution effort requires components that Iran cannot produce domestically. If China is supplying those components through channels the blockade cannot seal, does the military preparation timeline outpace the financial collapse timeline? Open Loop 3 is operational. 8 large white aircraft with no visible markings, no filed flight plans, and no transponder signatures consistent with civilian cargo operations entered Iranian airspace during the ceasefire period, carrying payloads that multiple intelligence agencies assessed as weapons components or precursor materials originating from Russian or Chinese territory. Those aircraft have not been publicly identified, their cargo has not been publicly confirmed, and the intelligence assessment of their payload has not been declassified. All 3 of these loops require answers. The second half of this analysis will close what can be closed. What cannot be closed will tell you more about where this conflict is heading than anything that can. Shiraz sits at 29. 6 degrees north latitude, 850 kilometers southeast of Tehran, approximately 560 kilometers northeast of the Strait of Hormuz choke point that American naval forces have enforced since April 13th. It is the capital of Fars province, a region that Iranian military planners designated as a primary dispersal location for missile storage infrastructure across 4 decades of systematic underground construction. The geographic logic is precise. Fars province's distance from the Gulf coastline places its deepest facilities outside the effective range of naval-launched Tomahawk Block V cruise missiles, which carry a maximum operational range of approximately 1,700 kilometers but require terminal approach corridors that the Zagros mountain terrain complicates significantly. The province's proximity to the Zagros geological formation provides the specific type of bedrock, dense limestone and metamorphic basement rock, at depths exceeding 200 meters, that makes hardened tunnel construction feasible and penetration resistant. The underground facilities in the Fars province network are what Iranian military doctrine formally designates as Share-e-Moshak, missile cities. Tunnel complexes excavated into bedrock at operational depths ranging from 30 meters for the most recently constructed secondary sites to an estimated 80 to 500 meters for the hardened primary launch facilities. Each complex is designed around the specific requirement of surviving a conventional strike campaign conducted by a peer adversary with access to precision-guided penetrating munitions. Iran built this architecture with a specific doctrinal requirement in mind. Survivable second strike capability. A missile force that can be destroyed in a single strike package provides no deterrence value after that strike. A missile force distributed across hundreds of hardened underground locations, some mapped, some not, forces any adversary planning a disarming strike to achieve near-complete intelligence coverage of every facility simultaneously, an intelligence requirement that has historically been impossible to satisfy before a military campaign begins. The specific problem that Operation Epic Fury created for this doctrine was not what it destroyed, it was what it chose not to destroy. The campaign's Phase 1 targeting package was designed around operational urgency, command and launch infrastructure, above-ground transporter erector launchers assessed as mission-ready at the time of the strike, fuel storage and pre-launch processing nodes, radar and targeting networks feeding the mobile launcher force. A missile sitting 300 meters underground in a sealed tunnel section in the Zagros Mountains poses no immediate threat to an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer in the Red Sea. A missile on an operational mobile launcher, with its command link active and its targeting radar synchronized, reaches that destroyer in approximately 8 minutes from central Iranian launch coordinates. Phase 1 targeted the threat that was immediately operational. It left the stored inventory for Phase 2. The 90% underground facility access recovery documented in the New York Times assessment means Iran has spent the ceasefire reconnecting that stored inventory to a reconstructed launch infrastructure. The components to complete that reconnection, guidance electronics, solid propellant management equipment, telemetry systems, are the specific items that the blockade was designed to interdict. And they are the specific items that the Chinese weapons supply operation has been documented delivering through channels the blockade cannot seal. This is not background context. This is the direct causal chain between the Chinese cargo vessels in the Hormuz zone, the Air-Seas reconstitution activity in Shiraz, and the B-1 training runs tracking south from England. The New York Times assessment requires careful analytical reading because its surface numbers generate 2 opposite interpretations depending on the baseline applied. The dismissive interpretation, Operation Epic Fury, failed. Iran retains 70% of what it started with. The campaign accomplished little at extraordinary cost. The correct interpretation is more specific and more consequential. Iran's pre-war ballistic missile inventory, accumulated across 3 decades of domestic production at facilities including the Shahid Himat Industrial Group Complex in Tehran province, the Shahid Bagheri Industrial Group in Semnan, and the dispersed production network in Loristan and Khuzestan provinces, was assessed at between 3,000 and 4,000 ballistic and cruise missiles of varying range and payload capacity before the campaign began. This figure is drawn from a Defense Intelligence Agency open-source assessment published in 2024 and cited in subsequent congressional testimony. 70% of that inventory remaining after a strike campaign lasting less than 3 weeks does not indicate failure. It indicates that total inventory elimination across every hardened facility in a country of 1,648,195 square kilometers was never the campaign's operational objective. The specific weapon system that Phase 2 targeting is built around is the GEOPOLITICAL Massive Ordnance Penetrator, a 30,000-pound precision guided earth penetrating bomb with a hardened steel casing engineered to punch through approximately 60 meters of reinforced concrete or 40 meters of bedrock before its 5,300-pound tritonal warhead detonates. The B-2 Spirit stealth bomber carries 2 GEOPOLITICAL-57s per sortie, a payload configuration that restricts the platform to 2 aim points per penetration run, but delivers terminal energy at those points that no other conventional weapon in the American inventory can replicate. The B-2 Spirit's unrefueled combat radius is approximately 6,900 kilometers. From Diego Garcia in the British Indian Ocean Territory, a confirmed B-2 operating location with hardened shelters, munitions storage, and the aerial refueling infrastructure that extends the B-2's operational range to any point on Earth, the distance to the deepest Iranian underground facilities in the Zagros chain is approximately 3,400 kilometers, well within unrefueled radius, well within the stealth coding threshold that defeats the surviving elements of Iran's S-300 PMU-2 air defense network, whose gap coverage was extensively mapped by RC-135 rivet joint aircraft during the weeks before Operation Epic Fury commenced. The GEOPOLITICAL-57 restock contract, awarded at a cost exceeding $100 million, was finalized in the weeks following Operation Epic Fury's conclusion. The Air Force does not award $100 million emergency restock contracts for weapons it does not expect to use. This is not a theoretical targeting discussion. This is an active procurement action for the specific ordnance that Phase 2 targeting requires, proceeding on the timeline that Operation Sledgehammer's planning is generating. The specific connection that the 90% facility access recovery number creates for this analysis is that Iran's reconstitution activity is simultaneously rebuilding its military capability and expanding the target set for the campaign designed to eliminate that capability. Every underground facility that Airgeek engineering units dig out during the ceasefire window becomes a cataloged aim point in a targeting package that did not include it during Phase 1 because its operational status was not confirmed. Satellite imagery captures the surface activity. Signals intelligence captures the communications coordinating the recovery operation. And occasionally, as the Shiraz explosion on May 13th demonstrates, the activity itself produces an event signature that confirms the facility type and operational content with more analytical certainty than passive surveillance alone generates. Stay with me, because this is where the China dimension transforms the entire strategic calculation from a bilateral military confrontation into a 3-actor race against converging timelines. If you are following this conflict closely and want to go deeper on the specific technical architecture of Iran's underground missile city network, the precise geological conditions that determine which facilities the GEOPOLITICAL-57 can reach, the delivery parameters the B-2's mission planning requires against each target tier, and the historical precedent from the Osirak and Al-Kibar strikes that contextualizes what a Phase 2 deep penetration campaign would and would not achieve against a dispersed, hardened target set, the membership program provides the extended analysis that goes beyond what fits in a public format. Members receive the full facility-level assessment, the targeting sequence logic that CENTCOM's planning process is applying to the night assessment numbers, and the specific geographic and geological constraints that determine which components of the reconstituted inventory are reachable and which are not. If you want the full analysis rather than the summary, that is where to find it. The Chinese weapons supply story is not a peripheral dimension of this conflict. It is the variable that determines whether Iran's missile reconstitution effort reaches operational completion before the financial pressure timeline produces capitulation or regime fracture. The mechanism is specific. Iran's underground missile storage facilities are not self-sufficient operational systems. Reconnecting stored ballistic missiles to functional launch infrastructure requires components that Iran cannot produce domestically at the precision and scale the reconstitution effort demands. Guidance system electronics, solid propellant management and conditioning equipment, telemetry and command link hardware, specific metallurgical inputs for re-entry vehicle fabrication. The sanctions architecture assembled across 20 years of Iranian nuclear diplomacy specifically targeted these supply chains at their choke points, the international financial system, the maritime shipping routes, the dual-use technology transfer channels. The blockade enforcement that CENTCOM has been executing since April 13th, 67 vessels intercepted. 4 engaged with defensive munitions for non-compliance, producing the night vision boarding footage released publicly showing door. Gunners locked, and the clinical application of force Admiral Cooper, described as standard operating procedure, was designed to seal the maritime import route that previously moved these components through. Gulf, intermediaries, and Pakistani port facilities. What the blockade cannot seal is the overland route through Pakistan's Balochistan province into Iran's eastern border crossings at Mirjava and Zahedan. And what it cannot seal, without triggering a direct diplomatic confrontation with Beijing, is the Chinese flagged vessel traffic transiting the Hormuz enforcement zone during windows of maximum diplomatic sensitivity. 1 Chinese vessel has been stopped and its cargo assessed. Additional transits have been documented and flagged in intelligence reporting that has not been publicly released. The 8 large unmarked white aircraft observed entering Iranian airspace during the ceasefire period. No transponder data, no filed international flight plans, payload profiles assessed by at least 2 allied intelligence agencies as consistent with weapons components from Russian or Chinese origin, represent a supply channel that operates in the electromagnetic and regulatory gaps that conventional blockade enforcement cannot address. The specific doctrinal implication of continued Chinese weapons delivery is that it decouples the Iranian missile reconstitution timeline from the financial pressure timeline that the blockade was designed to make the binding operational constraint. This is not an abstract strategic concern. This is the precise tension the Trump-sized summit was convened to address. And the Chinese cargo vessels transiting the Hormuz enforcement zone during the summit's 36-hour window are not an accident of operational scheduling. Beijing understands, with the precision of a government that has conducted detailed behavioral analysis of American enforcement decision-making, that intercepting a Chinese flagged vessel while the American president is seated across from the Chinese president generates an immediate diplomatic incident that restructures the summit's agenda around the interception rather than the Iran nuclear framework that both. Delegations, designated as the primary agenda item. The interception becomes the summit. The summit cannot be what it was designed to be. This is not improvised logistics management. This is deliberate timing, calibrated to American political sensitivity. Chinese vessels transiting during the summit. Iranian commandos infiltrating Kuwait during the ceasefire. Rear admirals expanding the declared operational Hormuz zone by a factor of 10 during active negotiations. Reconnaissance. Testing. Probing for the exceptions and thresholds that define where enforcement actually stops. The specific intelligence operation embedded in the Chinese vessel transits is to determine whether the blockade has a Beijing exception and whether that exception can be reliably activated by timing transits to coincide with diplomatic sensitivity windows. If American naval forces intercept the vessel, Beijing has the confrontation it can weaponize at the summit table. If American naval forces stand down because of the summit, Beijing has identified a repeatable enforcement gap that can be exploited at every subsequent diplomatic interval. The answer to that probe is being generated right now, in the Strait of Hormuz, by the ships of the Fifth Fleet and the enforcement decisions being made at CENTCOM's forward headquarters in Qatar. Components arriving. Facilities recovered. Mobile launchers reconstituted. That is the operational picture China's weapons supply is accelerating toward completion. Now let us steelman the Iranian position, because intellectual honesty demands we take their options seriously rather than dismissing them as empty bluster. Iran is operating on 3 strategic assumptions its command structure assessed as viable when the ceasefire began on April 7th. First assumption, the reconstitution window is long enough to matter. The ceasefire, however nominal, provides operational cover for the underground facility recovery effort. If 90% facility access can be confirmed, and the stored missile inventory reconnected to functional launch infrastructure before resumed hostilities begin, the targeting problem for Phase 2 becomes fundamentally different from Phase 1, because the targets are now dispersed across a larger geographic footprint, hardened to greater depths, and numerous enough to challenge the penetrating munitions inventory before the mission objectives are met. A target set with 400 confirmed facility nodes cannot be destroyed in a single strike package by a bomber force with finite Gibu 57 inventory. Mathematical, not emotional. Second assumption, Chinese weapons supply and the diplomatic cover of the Beijing summit create a component delivery channel the blockade cannot permanently interdict. Every week of continued delivery narrows the gap between current reconstitution status and operational readiness. Operational readiness, in RG doctrine, is the condition that restores deterrence credibility. Restored deterrence credibility changes the negotiating position. Third assumption, the RGC's surviving special operations capability, the commando infiltration network, the Iraqi Shia militia infrastructure, the Kuwaiti sleeper cell architecture, represents a cost imposition tool that raises the price of resumed major combat operations beyond what American domestic political tolerance supports in an election cycle. The problem with this strategic logic is that every single one of these assumptions is being systematically undermined. The reconstitution window is generating the targeting list that makes it counterproductive. Every facility the Iraqi digs out during the ceasefire is a facility the satellite constellation, the RC-135 collection architecture, and the seismic monitoring network are cataloging for the Jibu 57 delivery sequence. The gas leak in Shiraz is on the targeting list now. The activity that caused it is confirmed. The facility type is confirmed. Iran is building the target package for Operation Sledgehammer by conducting the very reconstitution it believes will prevent Operation Sledgehammer. The Chinese vessel transits during the summit are being documented, assessed, and factored into the post-summit enforcement posture upgrade that will be implemented regardless of what the summit produces diplomatically. Beijing does not get to supply weapons indefinitely under diplomatic cover without that cover being progressively narrowed, and the Kuwait commando operation failed. Publicly, with 4 operatives in Kuwaiti custody whose interrogations are currently producing intelligence about RGC operational planning that the Iranian command structure cannot contain or recall. 3 assumptions, 3 systematic failures. The mathematical reality does not change because the RGC's institutional survival logic requires treating the assumptions as sound. The analogy is a man locked in a room who, rather than searching for the exit, spends every available hour reinforcing the walls. He believes the reinforced walls will eventually force his captors to negotiate on his terms. At 30 minutes, the walls are stronger. At 90 minutes, he has consumed the oxygen that the sealed, reinforced room no longer replaces. The walls did not save him. They completed his containment. The RGC is reinforcing the walls. The oxygen is the 3 to 4 month CIA financial endurance window, and the B-2s are carrying the tools that make the depth of the reinforcement irrelevant. The Shiraz explosion sits at the precise intersection of 3 converging operational realities: the missile reconstitution urgency, the compressed timeline imposed by the ceasefire's uncertain duration, and the specific risks of handling ballistic ordnance that has been subject to the structural stress of underground facilities in proximity to prior detonations. Underground ordnance handling under operational urgency is not equivalent to peacetime munitions management. The RGC's engineering and logistics units working the Fars province facilities are moving ballistic missiles through tunnel sections that absorbed the structural stress of Operation Epic Fury's strike packages, sections with potential partial collapse, compromised ventilation, and floor surfaces disrupted by blast-induced subsidence. They are operating under the time pressure imposed by a ceasefire window whose expiration they cannot predict with certainty. They are handling propellant compounds whose stability parameters may have been altered by the temperature cycling and humidity variations of the storage conditions those facilities experienced during and after the strikes. The probability of an uncontrolled detonation during this kind of operation is not 0. The probability compounds with the intensity of the time pressure. The explosion in Shiraz is the signature of that compound probability exceeding its threshold at a specific facility on a specific night. The intelligence value of the event for CENTCOM's targeting process is considerable. Every active underground facility in the reconstitution effort generates a signature envelope, surface entry and exit traffic captured by satellite, communications coordination captured by SIGINT, thermal signatures from the ventilation and power systems required to operate the tunnels, and now the acoustic, seismic, and thermal signature of a detonation event that confirms facility type. Operational content and structural depth more precisely than any passive surveillance product alone could establish. Inside Iran's fractured command architecture, this creates a specific problem. 2 factions are operating with fundamentally incompatible assessments of the current strategic situation. The pragmatist faction, centered around Foreign Minister Aragki, the civilian diplomatic apparatus, and elements of the Hassan Rouhani-era technocratic infrastructure that survived the consolidation, understands that the financial trajectory is catastrophic and that a negotiated settlement preserving regime survival is preferable to the alternative. The nihilistic faction, the ERC's operational command structure, specifically the Missile Forces Directorate and the Quds Force Strategic Planning Component, is running commando operations into Kuwait while Araghchi is claiming Iranian victimhood, conducting weapons reconstitution in Shiraz while the summit runs in Beijing, authorizing vessel transits through the blockade zone during the diplomatic window. These are not the same actors. They are not coordinating. The faction holding the weapons does not answer to the faction holding the negotiating portfolio. Command authority, negotiating authority, operational execution. 3 separate centers, 3 separate calculations, 0 reliable coordination between them. That structural fracture is the most dangerous single feature of the current situation, not the missiles, not the Chinese components. The institutional reality that the people with launch authority are not the people at the table in Beijing. The Trump-Xi summit is not diplomatic background to the operational developments documented in this analysis. It is the single remaining variable that can alter the trajectory every other indicator is pointing toward. Treasury Secretary Besant confirmed Iran as a centerpiece of the summit agenda. China hosted Foreign Minister Araghchi in Beijing in the days immediately preceding the summit, a specific sequencing that placed Chinese messaging to Araghchi before the summit rather than during it, allowing Beijing to communicate its position to Tehran before sitting down with Washington. Beijing told Araghchi a deal needs to happen. Araghchi communicated back what the RGC's institutional command structure permits him to communicate. The civilian diplomatic faction understands, but cannot authorize without RGC permission. The RGC's survival logic prohibits granting. The specific diplomatic leverage China holds that no other actor in this conflict possesses is the oil purchase relationship. China purchases approximately 90% of Iran's current oil export volume, the surviving revenue stream the blockade has compressed to its operational minimum. A Chinese commitment to reduce those purchases or condition continued purchases on Iranian nuclear concessions accelerates the physics clock on Karg Island's storage crisis in ways that compress the CIA's 3 to 4 month endurance estimate into something considerably shorter. The storage tanks on Karg Island have a finite capacity. Uranium production wells that cannot offload into tankers must shut down within 72 hours of reaching storage saturation. Wells that have been shut down cannot be restarted without equipment and expertise that sanctions have made difficult to source. Military pressure. Financial pressure. Chinese oil purchase leverage. 3 compressive forces operating simultaneously. That is the combination that forces a decision from an institutional command structure that is otherwise willing to accept indefinite daily attrition. The summit's output determines more about when the B-1's training missions become operational sorties than any decision the Ergi makes inside its coastal cave complexes. The blockade stands at 67 vessels intercepted and holding. 4 vessels shot up for non-compliance. $500 million per day compounding. 73 Iranian tankers motionless in Gulf anchorages. The B-1s are running training missions from England toward the Middle East. The Jibu 57 restock contract is awarded. Operation Sledgehammer is under active Pentagon discussion with a naming that signals operational proximity rather than theoretical contingency planning. The Shiraz explosion has confirmed active underground missile reconstitution in a city where facilities that were not in Phase 1's targeting package have now confirmed their operational status through the event that destroyed part of one of them. 4 RGC commandos are in Kuwaiti custody, being interrogated about the operational planning that authorized their mission and the command structure that directed it. Saudi Arabia has confirmed offensive strikes on Iranian-backed militias in southern Iraq near the Iraq-Saudi border, placing Riyadh alongside the UAE and the United States as confirmed offensive actors in this conflict. The UAE has steel-cage defensive structures going up over oil storage infrastructure, an emergency installation timeline that reflects an institutional assessment of imminent rather than theoretical drone threat. Chinese vessels are transiting the blockade during the summit window. 8 unidentified white aircraft have entered Iranian airspace with unconfirmed but intelligence-assessed weapons payloads. Does the Beijing summit produce a Chinese commitment to halt weapons component supply that is specific enough, verifiable enough, and enforced consistently enough to stop the reconstitution timeline before it crosses the threshold that makes Operation Sledgehammer's execution a strategic requirement rather than a coercive option? Does the RGC's nihilistic faction authorize another commando operation in Kuwait, in the Way, in Bahrain, or against a Gulf partner whose alignment with the coalition has made it a targeting priority during the summit's remaining hours, producing the incident that collapses the ceasefire before the financial pressure trajectory reaches its terminal point? And what exactly did the 4 RGC commandos in Kuwaiti custody disclose about the operational planning that authorized the Kuwait infiltration, the command authority that directed it, and the target set and timeline the mission was designed to serve? Those 3 questions have no public answers today. Subscribe and turn on notifications immediately, because the Beijing summit's conclusion in the next 36 hours is the development that every subsequent analysis of this conflict's next phase will identify as the moment when the diplomatic track either converged with or was permanently separated from the operational timeline the B-1 training runs are maintaining. Drop your prediction in the comments right now. Does China commit to halting weapons supply at the Beijing summit, or do the B-1's training missions become operational sorties before the ceasefire window expires?